I'm very happy to welcome Professor Robert Desjarlais, who's a professor of anthropology at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, and currently the recipient of a Humboldt Research Award from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and a former fellow of our institute in 2020-2021. The topic is a critical phenomenology of experience, and thank you so much for joining us, and feel free to share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you. It's very good to be here and to be back at the Paris IAS and to engage in such generative ways with all of our work. So so there's an abiding question I was thinking about this week that sort of motivates a lot of my research. And this is the question: how might we go about understanding the complicated and ever-shifting nuances of bodily experience, sensory perception, consciousness, relationality, and memory, time, and history in our lives and the lives of others? And I've worked in many different sort of settings, but this is the question I keep coming back to in one way or another. And so today I'm going to talk at first in a kind of more general sort of conceptual way, and then I'm going to talk about the particular research and film project that I'm undertaking now. My earlier research, my anthropological research, was in Nepal among the people called Yomo people. And this is a Tibetan Buddhist people that I've worked with in depth, both in Nepal and in Queens, New York. And I've written 3 books that engage with the lives of Yomo people: Body and Emotion, which is about illness and healing. Sensory Biographies are these life histories of elders within the community. And then a book titled Subject to Death, which really looks at the dynamics of dying, death, and the funeral rites for Yomo people. More recently, I've worked in Paris, and a book of mine that came out in 2022 is Traces of Violence, Writings on the Disaster in Paris, France. And I just want to make sure I'm getting a message, but I don't know if it's someone from which really looks in a kind of in-depth, careful way on recent histories of violence in France, both those that came and followed in the wake of the attacks in November 2015, as well as police actions of harassment and surveillance and violence in certain neighborhoods in Paris. And this is co-authored with a colleague of mine, Halil Habri. Most recently, I've been doing a book project, and this is what I was doing when I was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in 2020, a project called Wounded, The Life Death of Abdelkahar Benahar. And this is a book project that's in the final stages of review, and it should be coming out with Duke University Press. And this is an in-depth inquiry into the life and death of this one man from Algeria, Abdelkahar Benahar, who died in October 1961. And he's known through a set of photographs that were taken of him the night before he died, when he was seriously beaten up, probably by Paris police officers. But that's a presentation for another day. One of the main sort of conceptual orientations that I've been engaged with is something that's called critical phenomenology, to look at particular aspects of life and experience and subjectivity from a phenomenological perspective, but also with a kind of critical edge, where you're looking at the dynamics of power, of relationality, of language that inform those experiences. And one of these projects that is sort of manifested through this work is a book I wrote on shelter blues, which is an ethnography of a homeless shelter in Boston. And during that time, I wrote an essay called Struggling Along: The Possibilities for Experience Among the Homeless Mentally Ill. And this came out a good 30 years ago, it's hard to believe, in 1994. And this is a reflection, a kind of critical analysis of the concept of experience in anthropology, philosophy, and everyday life, where I try to trace out the genealogy of experience. And one of the main arguments I make is that experience is not a natural category. It's not a natural given in life, which you tend to find in anthropological writings and in philosophy. It's sort of like the presumed foundation of human life. And what I try to show is that it's constituted through complicated dynamics of history, of political relations, of culture, and to sort of show that it's a construct. It's not a natural given in life. And to do that, in the essay, I compare it with what I call struggling along, which is what I found occurred most often for people living in the homeless shelter that they didn't really experience in a kind of rich, in-depth, transformative way, but they kind of struggled along in a day-to-day way through their lives. And so that's an essay that has had some significance, I think, in anthropology. And then I co-authored a review essay with a colleague of mine called Phenomenological Approaches in Anthropology, where we reviewed the work in phenomenological approaches. And these are the two writings that came to mind immediately when I received the invitation from Paulius and to return to the Paris IAS and Saudi as well to rewrite an essay or to take some kind of thinking further. So one more recent history involved is that a colleague of mine, Michael Schnegg, who I've invited to join us today for the discussion, wrote an essay last year called Phenomenological Anthropology, Philosophical Concepts for Ethnographic Use. And this is an important essay that advances Michael's own approach to phenomenological work in anthropology. And it was published in November 2023. And I was asked to write a response along with other scholars who have knowledge of this field. So my brief response is called The Question of Experience, where I return to these questions I had about experience. And then within direct conversations with Michael, we found that there was still more work needed to be done on this issue. So we've organized a workshop that will take place at the University of Hamburg in early July, where we've invited a number of scholars to sort of really reflect on this question of what is experience. Both anthropologists and philosophers will join us with that engagement. And a key thinker for me through all this work has been Walter Benjamin. I'm sure many of you know who he was. He was born in 1892 in Berlin, and he died in September 1940 while trying to cross the Pyrenees from France to Spain, but being stopped at the border. And then he took his own life when he realized that he could not go further and he would have to return to France and probably put into the hands of the Gestapo. And this is a passage that I found in Benjamin just quite recently that struck me. So I'll read it quickly. In an early essay, I mobilized all the rebellious forces of youth against the word experience. And now this word has become a supporting element in many of my things. Nevertheless, I've remained true to myself because my attack penetrates the word without destroying it. It penetrated to the heart of the matter. And when I read this, it's one of these moments that I think we can all relate to. It's something that I could have written because in the rebellious time of my own youth, I wrote against the concept of experience and I tried to sort of, explore it in depth, but without destroying it as well. And so this is sort of the crux of what I'm engaged with today. So one of the things that's interesting about Benjamin's approach to the concept of experience is that he's looking at the many historical, political, and technological underpinnings of the concept of experience. And he wrote about what he called the poverty of experience in 20th century Europe, that he thought that the very nature of experience was getting destroyed and impoverished within cultural and political life in the early 20th century. And one of the things that's most interesting about his work is he made a distinction between two kinds of experience. And these are two words in everyday life that are used in German, Erlebnis, which I think most often relates to a notion of episodic, sensate experience, and Erfahrung, transformative experience. And in English, we don't make this distinction within the word experience. I'm not sure in French that distinction is made, or in Spanish, for instance, but in German, people use these. And so Erlebnis is almost like sensory perception, sensory experience, but Erfahrung is a more transformative experience. It's something that you can be enriched by and it can move you. And what Benjamin was arguing is that German society, at least in European society, was moving from a situation where Erfahrung was foundational to where Erlebnis was taking hold and becoming more prominent. And we don't have to agree with Benjamin, but I think his attempt to analyze structures of experience and forms of experience and the historical foundations of them, I think is very compelling. So this all relates to the current research and film project that I'm involved with now. And I think of it as Walter Benjamin's Berlin childhood around 2024. And this is a kind of play with the title of one of his books, which is Berlin Childhood around 1900. This is the German version of it, Berliner Kindheit of 1900. And then this is a translation, Berlin Childhood around 1900, translated by Howard Island with Harvard University Press. And so these are just some images of Benjamin as a child. So this is a book that Benjamin reflects, drawing from memories of his life world as a child, growing up in Berlin in a kind of middle-class bourgeois household, and trying to understand the situation of his own life within its historical circumstances. And so what I'm doing with this project is I'm drawing from Benjamin's own ideas and writings to craft a series of films about Benjamin's childhood. And in many respects, it's kind of field work in filmmaking. I'm kind of engaged phenomenologically with the very process of filmmaking, and I'm taking notes along the way. And maybe this is something I'll write about this whole project. In the preface to Berlin Childhood, Benjamin talks about his effort to get hold of the images of his childhood. And he was writing while in exile. He was writing while living in France and in other places. And there's a kind of air of nostalgia and melancholy of this past that has been lost to him, but also the city of his youth, of Berlin. He was writing at the time thinking he might not be able to return for some time. And in fact, he never was able to. So these are some of the sections of it, of the book. And what I've been trying to do is plan for and do research for and actually do the filming for a number of these sections to create brief films. And I've made 3 today, which are now posted on Vimeo. If any of you would like to have the links, I could send them on to you very easily. One is Boys' Books, where he writes about his love for reading children's books. Der Mond, the moon, is his reflection on the presence of the moon in his life when he's a young boy, particularly when he's trying to sleep at night in his bedroom. And then Das Bucklige Männlein is about a mythical figure that you find in fairy tales and songs, the hunchback little man who Benjamin felt was sort of accompanying through his own life from a child on to his adult life. And so with these films, I've been sort of constructing particular phenomenological engagements that somehow convey the gist of the writings in my own reflections. So for the film Der Mond, the moon, I've been filming the moon in Berlin, trying to trace its pathways, both within night scenes within Berlin, but also the sort of the light of the moon as it streams into a bedroom at night, which is more difficult because it's so dark. It's been hard to film the moon in that way. But this is the first sentence, for instance. The light that streams down from the moon is not directed at the scene of our everyday, our daily existence. And then he goes on to write about how the moon disturbs him while he's trying to sleep at night and starts provoking these kind of unsettled awareness of the presence of life, both on the moon and on Earth, and really leading to a kind of existential doubts about the nature of existence. So I've been trying to work with these themes. The current project is about another section, Abreise and Rückkehr, departure and return. And so this is a brief text where Benjamin writes about going on holiday travels with his family. And he writes about, leaving in the morning to go to the train station, and encountering the train stations, and then returning home, or at least trying to return home. And he mentions 2 train stations. Neither of these exist anymore. Stettiner Bahnhof, which was just to the north of Mitte, the middle neighborhood in Berlin. It's where Nordbahnhof is now. And these are some of the photographs of it. One thing you can see here is sort of the roof. So Stettiner Bahnhof was severely damaged during World War II because of Allied bombing, and then it eventually was torn down. And now there's a plaza there, and I think a bank, the Deutsche Bank is there. So if you walk by there without knowing it, you wouldn't know that this very important train station actually once stood there. And then the other station, even more important, was Anhalter Bahnhof, which is just close to Potsdamer Platz. And this was the main train station for any trains that were heading south. And Benjamin would have gone on entered this station many times, both as a boy and as an adult. And it was a very important train station. He writes about it in very intriguing ways. And then it too was destroyed in World War II, and it no longer exists. It was finally the remnants of it were finally torn down, except for this one part of the entrance that still exists today as a kind of memorial to the events and the histories of that train station. And one thing to note is that there's these train tracks that still exist that once led from the Anhalter Bahnhof into a park known as Park am Gleisdreieck. And this is close to where I was living. And these are the kind of scenes you find. They just go through the woods in a kind of very kind of spectral, haunting way. And this is what I've been filming as well. So the film I'm making now is called Ghost Tracks. It's a film in progress, and I really appreciate the month here to develop the film. The subtitle could be something like Spectres of Walter Benjamin's Departure and Return from Berlin Childhood around 1900. And these are the first sentences. And I'm going to show you the clip that conveys these, but I thought I would read them first. The streak of light under the bedroom door the night before, when the others were still up, wasn't this the first sign of departure? Didn't it penetrate a child's night full of expectation, like the strip of light under the stage curtain for an audience later in the night? So you can even see here, there's a kind of phenomenological dimension to Benjamin's writing, and implicitly a critical phenomenological aspect to his work. And so I've been trying to, the whole question for me is, how do I convey this through film? And one thing to note is I've been working with the text very closely, reading, analyzing each sentence within the German. And I'm finding that each sentence is a threshold sentence between different states of consciousness, of space or time. And then there's very much these kind of complex worlds of time and perception involved within the whole text. And I think this is either intentional or semi-intentional on Benjamin's part. So I've been trying to really engage with the very spirit of the language. People write about how each of the texts in Berlin Childhood has its own distinct sign system. And I think there's a distinct sign system within this particular text. And then this is the next sentence. I think that the dream ship that carried us off back then often swayed in front of our beds over the noise of the waves of conversation and the spray of clattering plates. And in the early morning, it set us down feverish, as if we had already completed the journey we're about to embark on. So keep in mind that Benjamin's writing as a 7 or 8-year-old boy, eager, anticipating, and I can relate to this when I was a child, when we would go on vacations and, in the summertime, and we'd all get into our station wagon, and I could hear my adults up at night preparing for it and then needing to wake up early. And so he's trying to come back to this life world of a child and the perceptions of a child. So I thought I would show you a brief clip from the beginning, and I just have to find the right place to start. I think you shouldn't be hearing sound. And we tested it earlier.
And I don't think we have sound.
Yeah, the sound will come in a moment, I think.
Okay, sorry.
Should.
Abreise und
Sound
Rückkehr.
now?
Der Lichtstreif unter der Schlafzimmertür. Am Vorabend, wenn die anderen noch auf waren, war er nicht das erste Reisesignal?
The strip of light under the bedroom door the night before, when the others were still up. Wasn't this the first signal of departure?
Drang er nicht in die Kindernacht voller Erwartung?
Didn't it penetrate a child's night, full of expectation, like the strip of light under the stage curtain for an audience later in the night?
Ich glaube, das Traumschiff, das einen damals abholte, ist oft über den Lärm der Gespräche.
I think that the dream ship that carried us off back then often swayed in front of our beds, over the noise of the waves of conversation and the spray of clattering plates. And in the early morning, it set us down feverish, as if we had already completed the journey we were about to embark on.
Fahrt in einer ratternden Droschke, die den Landwehrkanal entlang fuhr und in der mir plötzlich...
While riding in a rattlingly hackney carriage along the Landwehr Canal, my heart suddenly grew heavy. Certainly not because of what was to come or what had been left behind. Rather, the dreariness of sitting together, which still continued, had not faded from the breath of the journey, like a ghost before dawn. This overwhelmed me with sadness.
Überschlich mich mit Traurigkeit. aber nicht lange.
But not for long. For by the time the carriage had passed the main thoroughfare, I was back to thinking about our train journey. Ever since, the dunes of Koserow or Venningsted have loomed before me on Invalidenstrasse, where others have only encountered the sandstone masses of Stetina station. Okay, so maybe we could end there. I think the 20 minutes are complete. There's so much more I could talk for hours about this. But maybe one thing to note at the end is you can see there's different temporalities involved. Benjamin had this notion of the Zeitraum, the time space of one particular situation. And I find that the film has several of these time spaces. There's the Berlin around 1900 on the threshold between the 19th and 20th century. There's Berlin and Benjamin in 1932 writing the first versions of this text, coming back to it later in the 1930s. There's the rise of Nazi Germany from 33 up until 45. And then there's the final months of Benjamin's life. And all these are interwoven in very complicated ways. So through the film, I'm trying to convey this. And I think this will eventually lead to writing as well. And then in some ways, I think of it as a kind of critical phenomenology of experience. From a kind of, in a way, it's a kind of Benjaminian analysis of Benjamin's writings and then situating that within the contemporary moment. Okay, so.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Right, so we have time for questions. I see Sadi.
Thank you very much, Robert. First, fantastic, the idea of making a film. Paris Ideas said it was super open to any format, and congratulations. And I think if you want to convey something about experience and phenomenology, this is a better medium than text. Then I think you put, and I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but you mentioned time, and I think the critical thing here is that life is about repeated experience, right? And this is exactly what's in his text that you cite from Benjamin, that as if we had already completed the journey we were about to embark on, and this is exactly it. And so I wanted just to feed this thing that if you're interested in the difference between Erlebnis and Erfahrung, it's that the experience is transformative or not, right? And so the classic approach of psychology is Thorndike's law of effect, which says that actions that bring some kind of positive experience tend to be repeated, while those that bring negative experience tend to be avoided. And so what we can take out of this is that experience creates expectations, right? And our life is pretty much about, repeated experiences, and the question now becomes, does our experience match what we expect, right? And satisfaction is basically the difference between experience on the moment, and that is this alertness, and the expectation. And if you take this into long term, and I think this chimes with what you have shown us in this beginning of the film, is if you're interested in satisfaction of life, right? It's about whether in your repeated experiences, this matches your expectations or doesn't. And as you transform yourself, you transform your expectations through your experience, and probably the experience that you have of life is really based on that. And we understand the difference between what is our past and what are our current reactions according to our expectations. And you mentioned the tragic death of Walter Benjamin, and this is pretty much that too. Expectations based on experience and things that we don't want to repeat.
This is very interesting what you're noting, and I could explore that in in detail. But I like that idea of the expectation and then actually how things are played out. And there is this repetitiveness into the writing. It's almost like you're on a train journey with him. The way he uses language and he repeats words and the rhythmic quality, but it's also, he talks about how boring it is too, but it could lead to something transformative. But every text, and scholars have written about this, every text in the Berlin Childhood book, there's a construction of something. You could say it's an expectation or creating an image of something, and then a dispersal. It breaks away, it falls apart. And you could say his whole life was sort of predicated on that tension and that dynamic. One of the things that's most interesting is reading this text, and this is later versions of the film, and I'd be interested to know how you would make sense of this, is he describes certain situations. It's almost like an uncanny anticipation of events that happen later in Germany. So he has a passage where he talks about when he's leaving, and then he says, our house was transformed in memory. And he says, just as we were getting on the steps of the express train, there could have been people coming into the house, you know, and disturbing things, stealing things. And he describes the soft footsteps leaving traces in the dust. And to me, that brings to mind Kristallnacht with the Nazi German paratroopers storming into people's houses, destroying things, and you know, with walking through the houses. So it's almost, I don't know if it's an allegory, but he's anticipating these things. And he actually had a concept where he talks about, and this is in the preface of the book, he talks about how perhaps this work can show how later historical experience can be prefigured, preformed within the experience of a child. And he doesn't, the text itself is not conceptual, but I think this is one moment where he's talking about how the childhood's world almost like sets the stage for later experiences. And it's difficult for us to think, at least for me, to think about how someone can anticipate the future, but this tied into his larger framework. And so in the Arcades project, the Passage, he talks about how the 19th century is the prehistory of the 20th century. It sets up the form of it, almost like the archaeological bedrock, which later constitutes later experience. And so you can see it ties into these things. I wasn't thinking of an expectation, but I think it fits very much with what he's writing about, how there's certain imaginative constructs of how we think experience should happen, right? And then what happens within everyday life in terms of how they're constituted or not, or dispersed or repeated in that way. So thank you. It's very thought-provoking.
And Aurora.
Thank you, Bob. I'm sorry I missed, I think, the first few minutes because I had some troubles logging in, but this is all very interesting and fascinating. I wanted to ask a couple of questions, and actually, I mean, questions and points. So I think that when you initially spoke of that quote from Benjamin about the writing against the concept of experience, I don't know if you can go back to that quote. I think that was a very interesting point somehow, because I'm not I'm not even sure. I mean, it seemed to me that there was also something that had to do with experience in a phenomenological sense, right? And also how experience can be conveyed in words. So in this writing against experience, I'm not even sure that it's the concept of experience, but the very possibility of speaking about experience in language. So this was an interesting thing for me as a linguistic anthropologist, as you know, the possibility of words to capture. And also with respect to the distinction between Erlebnis and Erfahrung, I think that, yeah, for example, in Italian, we don't have something like that, but there's this very strict distinction between the event and the sedimentation of multiple events. And I think in this respect, we could perhaps think about it in relationship to the notion of enunciation that we discussed and the way in which the system, the langue, becomes parole. And so the sedimented system can actually, be experienced in a moment. So I don't know, that again was an interesting thing for me. And the other point, I mean, again, it's not really a question, but I'm wondering whether these discussions that you were having also earlier with respect to anticipation, and so this foresight and hindsight and these two different gazes, I wonder whether it wouldn't be interesting to combine this inquiry into this more autobiographical rumination by Benjamin with his work on the thesis on the philosophy of history, because I think that this image that he has about the angel of history, I'm trying to find, the famous quote. I mean, he was inspired by the painting by Paul Klee, and he was speaking about this angel whose face is turned towards the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage and earls, in front of his feet. So this angel that is basically imprisoned, I mean, his wings or their wings are, captured in a storm and is pulled towards the future, but is looking at the past. So it seems to me that there's a connection here between history in a larger sense and, the temporality of one's own biography and the way in which there's this sense of anticipation and, retrospective view into one's life. And on the other hand, it's you, Bob, are actually seeing it from an even further point in the future, but also you are kind of, pulled and you're going backwards as well. But there's something here that it's very interesting to me because it combines this more history of philosophy perspectives by Benjamin with this more autobiographical thing. I'm not sure anyone else has, made this point or looked into this, but I think it's an interesting point.
Okay, thank you, Aurora. Maybe I could introduce you, Aurora. So this is Aurora Donzelli, a professor of linguistic anthropology of University of Bologna, and long-term colleague of mine. We both taught at Sarah Lawrence College in New York for some time. And these are really great questions. Maybe I should note that the quote that he has about, penetrating the word experience, he's writing later in life about an essay he wrote in his early 20s when he was associated with the youth movement and education for young people, and it was a critique of more bourgeois concepts of experience. But I think the most important thing is that he dislodged the naturalism of it and the very word of it to show that it can be used in different ways and it relates to different people, and the enunciation of the concept can take different forms to use the language. I've thought about the concept of history. That essay is the most difficult one for me to read and understand, and I need to really work time with it. But it's fascinating as well. And you're right that image of the Paul Klee painting is a very striking one. And just to give some background, so Benjamin actually owned that that painting by Paul Klee, The Angel of History. I think in Klee called it the Angelus Novellis or something like that. He bought it from Klee in Paris, I think in the 1920s, early 1930s. But this figure of the angel looking back at history, just seeing this pile of destruction is a very striking one. And actually, when I presented this film project in Erlangen in Germany at a research institute last year, someone suggested that in some way the film project is like the angel of history, looking back and seeing these piles of ruins through time without any sense of redemption either. So I think you're right that to tie the temporal dimensions of Benjamin's own autobiography with the kind of philosophy of history and the history of the 20th century, this is essential. And I think one thing I really have to develop better is a kind of what is my approach to history within the film. And I'm working, sort of from the ground up with it, but I think this will sort of emerge through time. But these are key questions. I agree. Thank you.
Great. And we have Patrick next.
Yes, thanks very much. I really enjoyed this. And I think it was very useful to be reminded that experience means many things. And I think we all recognize that we have experiences and we think that's all there is to it. So thinking more carefully about what constitutes experiences is interesting. And I think a couple of comments. I mean, the first one is that what you present Benjamin is doing is, in a way, memory work. People often think of experience as instantaneous, something that happens in the moment. But of course, we remember them and we go over them and we perhaps reconstruct them as well as constructing them as they happen. We reconstruct them and we try to make sense of them. And I think your film and your quotes from Benjamin beautifully capture this reworking of experience. So I found that extremely interesting. All my own work is in the moment, and I've never sort of worried about that subsequent reworking. But there is one concept which is important for the subsequent reworking of experience, and I found it interestingly absent from what you were doing, and that's the concept of trauma. So in psychology, people are sort of quite rightly very concerned with traumatic experience and traumatic memory, and there's this idea that somehow there can be processes, therapies, interventions, events which can somehow help to reconstruct or process difficult experiences in a better way rather than a worse way. So that's really why psychology exists, at least as a clinical discipline. And I was sort of always expecting something traumatic in what you were describing about Benjamin. And of course, his subsequent life was deeply traumatic. But I got anxiety from what you were describing, but I didn't get trauma. So I just wondered if you have any comment on the relation between experience and trauma. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start with the latter thing you're noting. I think it's a key dynamic in his writing. He doesn't use the word trauma. I think, within the history of the concepts of trauma, I think you would agree that it really took form, I would say, after World War II. I mean, there were, after World War I, Freud was writing about trauma, but PTSD really took form like during the age of the Vietnam War. So I don't know if he uses that word. I'm not even sure what the word would be in German, but I think there were key traumatic events, and they're quietly embedded within this text. And one of them was that a good friend of his, I think Fritz Heine, who was around his age, he was a poet. He took his own life, he and his girlfriend, at the start of World War I as a kind of protest, as a kind of defiance. And Benjamin, they were good friends. Sometimes they would have arguments, but he was the intellect that he really enjoyed talking with. And they used to have this meeting house that they would use to go to and gather and have conversations, him and among in Benjamin's intellectual circle. And Benjamin received a note one night and said, "You will find our bodies in the meeting house." And so Benjamin went there, probably having a sense of what he was going to find, but he encountered the dead bodies. And he never, I mean, he writes about this in a kind of matter-of-fact way, but I think it was deeply upsetting for him, deeply traumatic. And so there's these themes of images of dead bodies, you know, in coffins and mausoleums that work their way through the whole text. And even the moon one, which is again this kind of anxiety, you're right, it's a key theme, and displacement. And one moment he says, like, I started to fear that I would return to bed and find myself already laid out upon it. And so there's these quiet kind of themes of trauma. But it's something I think I need to think through more. What are the events that, I mean, certainly in the late 1930s, these key traumatic events. He was I was just reading more closely about this, an internment camp at first in Cologne, just outside of Paris, in a sports stadium. He was interned there, and then another place outside of in Burgundy, and he almost like died because he was kind of, you know, left to his own resources, rather helpless. Other people helped him out. But I think a whole essay could be written about the trauma in Benjamin's life and his writings, even when he doesn't use the concept. So I would agree with you. And I do think like memory is a key theme here. In the preface, he uses a very striking image. I'd be wondering what you all think of it. He describes the same way that we get inoculations and we inject something into our system to survive. He says that he's living in this moment of exile and longing, so he injects a few images into his body so that he can deal with the absence, to deal with the longing. And this idea of incorporating some of these images. And the word he often uses for his writing at this time in his life is what he calls the denkbild, the figure of thought, the image of thought, the thought image. And so it's very image based. And I think, Patrick, you would agree that a lot of our everyday life is predicated on images, you know, and related to expectations as well. Like when I walk from the area past Notre Dame, I have a series of denkbeelds, what I'm going to encounter, you know, the reconstruction of Notre Dame, the island and everything. And so that's interwoven. And then there's the whole question of, is he remembering the way things actually happen as well? You know, so anyways, these are all, to me, very interesting thoughts. And to get back to what Sadi had said earlier, I do find it's been exciting for me to work with film. It does really convey this kind of phenomenological intensity of things in a way that's very different from writing. And even in constructing the films, I think of it as almost like a micro creative phenomenology, because as a filmmaker, and I think any filmmaker would agree, you're creating perception. And within the lived moment of the film, when to edit, when to cut, and when to add sound. And it's a very generative, in some ways, implicitly interactive process, which I find very interesting as well. And that could be written about too. So
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick.
Great, thank you. We are a little bit over time, but Michael, would you like to? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to ask this question, for this wonderful wonderful presentation, and also it's been very inspiring and very to see how you developed this project, which I had the fortune to already know a little bit since last year. So I would want to come back a little bit to the question of the experience, and probably asking who experiences what in this kind of triadic relationship between you, Benjamin, and different worlds that are emerging there. And so for me, it seems like you are talking about Benjamin's experience of the world in which he lives and the way he kind of transforms it into a piece of art or in his memories, but also you yourself experiencing his work or his piece of work, and also Berlin of today's time, or the way. So I found kind of the striking parallel that in both cases, it's kind of embedded into an aesthetic project, into transforming it into something, a book or a film or something. And I wonder where you see the parallels between these two projects that Benjamin is doing and that you are doing in terms of the experience or experiencing, and whether you think that this kind of experiencing and transforming it for a piece of art or kind of a message is somehow different than probably me experiencing walking home now without this kind of intentionality of transforming it into something. And
I think it's a great question. I do think there's a lot of parallels. So I'm getting to know Berlin as an adult, as an anthropologist, in the same way, similar to how Benjamin was learning Berlin as a child. And I think another parallel is that when he moved to Paris, he was learning about the history of Paris, for his library research there, and then just living in Paris and understanding art and literature. And I'm doing something similar in Berlin. So there are these, I don't know if they're uncanny parallels, but certainly, and we're both working towards a construction of these experiences through writing and images and filmmaking. So you're right, it's different from just going for a walk. I'm constantly have this kind of meta consciousness about how to think about Benjamin's experiences, how my experiences are in dialogue with his. And there's a kind of scaffolding, there's a kind of complex interrelations, and then how to convey this through either writing or film. And so there is this kind of, again, what's the right word for it? A kind of complicity, although complicity has negative connotations, of what Benjamin was doing and what I'm doing, in a kind of haunting way in some respects. And again, just one way this plays out is in July, I plan to go to the Pyrenees and retrace the path, the hiking path that Benjamin took to try to reach Spain, and with the film camera, to try to sort of, again, it's not the same experience, it's 100 years later, but to somehow have that dialogic encounter with the world, the traces and the histories involved. But it opens up all these very complicated questions on experience, which I think we can approach during the workshop in Germany. And I have more questions than answers at this point, which I think maybe is a good place. And I think through your work, Mikael, you've helped me to revisit this earlier writing of mine and to see that all these questions are still unresolved in anthropology and I think philosophy in terms of what is experience and how we can best make sense of it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have in the morning session. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us. Thank you so much to the audience.